In Psalm 139, we find David writing a very well-known psalm. Most of us probably know it at some point. Most of us probably know it as the pro-life psalm, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. We are knitted together in our mother's womb. All of our days are numbered. That's typically how we will probably remember Psalm 139. But before he ever gets there, he actually writes what is supposed to be a praise of God. But oftentimes the way that it has been preached or the way that it has been taught turns it from a psalm of praise into a psalm of dread. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this because I want to talk just briefly about this psalm and what it's supposed to mean versus what it often is said to mean. So here is Psalm 139, 7 through 12, where it says, "Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as day, for darkness is as light with you." And oftentimes this passage is misused, it is mispreached, it is mistaught. And it often goes, and this is how I grew up thinking that what this psalm meant was basically, you can't get away from God. He is omnipresent. And so when you are trying to get away with sin and darkness, God sees it there because sin, being in darkness, doesn't get you away from God. God sees it. It's like light to him. Everything that you think that you're doing in the dark, God sees. That's not what this psalm is saying at all. I mean, truly, God is omnipresent. Don't get me wrong. But that's not what this psalm is referring to. That, hey, you need to be careful. You need to watch out because God is watching. That's how I understood it for the longest time. And I was challenged to read the actual psalm in its context for what it actually means. And I discovered that this is actually a psalm of praise. In my highest of heights, God, when I am on a spiritual high, I have just come back from a Christian camp, right? And I am so tired, but I am so spiritually filled. You're there. You're there in those moments. But you're also there when I feel like death, Sheol, when I feel like I'm just in the grave. I'm just death warmed. I can't even get out of bed. God, you are there with your gracious hand. You are there with your strength in that moment too. So at my highest of heights and my lowest of lows, you are there. And then he says, and then in my darkest of darks, you're still there with your gracious hand. You're still there to love me. You are still there to guide me through this darkness, because even though I'm in darkness, even though I feel like I am living in such darkness, whether that is utmost depression or that is the darkest of dark sins, it doesn't necessarily matter, because God, you are there and your grace is still there. And I have nothing to fear because you will guide me through that. That's what David's saying here. And there are so many of us living at this moment, maybe in some darkness. We're having a really hard time. We may be in darkness of sin, or we may be in darkness of depression or something else of that nature, but we are in a dark place, and we need to take comfort that God has not abandoned us in that darkness. He is there in that darkness. He is still light in the midst of darkness, and his grace is still there, still present in that darkness. And I want you to keep that psalm in mind when I ask you simply this question. How do we respond when we see darkness falling around us? How is it that we are responding when darkness falls? When the power of darkness is so great? How do we respond to that? I mean, it could be personal darkness, right? I mean, it's just really about me. There's just something in me. There is darkness that is within, and really nobody else knows the struggle. Maybe a couple of people, they don't understand it. They don't know it. It is darkness, and I am feeling that, and it is overwhelming me. It might be political darkness. There are some of us that are concerned about this election. What if such and such person gets into the White House? Oh my goodness, what's going to happen to our nation? And we're feeling like there's just this darkness is just going to overshadow this nation. And so we're living in this darkness or the dread of darkness that might be coming. It could be familial darkness. There is just something going on with our family right now. Maybe it's our children, maybe it's our in-laws, maybe it's our brother and sister, and we're feeling this darkness like, man, like I can't take another day of this. It's just dark. I'm walking on eggshells all the time, everywhere. We're feeling dark times. Or it could be just simply societal. I mean, what we've experienced 2 days of utter darkness. Shooting in Georgia, and then yesterday the shooting in Kentucky. And there is just this darkness that just seems to be creeping in. What do we do? How do we respond to these things? This morning, I want us to look at how Jesus responded to the darkness that he was in, because he is consistent in his response. We're also going to see, though, why he responds the way that he does. So as we look at this passage this morning, we see 3 displays of darkness. Hopefully you'll like these 3. Because there is darkness displayed in the kiss. There is darkness displayed in the knife, and there is darkness displayed, this is the one you'll love, in the kerfuffle. Yes, there is. So if you will, please stand with me. I think this is the first time that I've ever used kerfuffle in a sermon. Let's read God's word, starting at verse 47. While he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. And Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and the elders who had come out against him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. Thank you. You may be seated. So here we have this, ultimately, hypocrisy at its greatest height. Do we not? I mean, this text, we see hypocrisy like never before. That which was always meant to be a sign of love, a sign of peace, the sign of friendship, all of a sudden, in one fell swoop, gets hijacked, and suddenly it becomes a sign of hatred, a sign of betrayal, a sign of enmity. And there in this darkness of night, the power of darkness is beginning to rise for everybody to see, everybody to understand. Remember, the disciples at this point really didn't get what was going on. They didn't understand what Jesus was talking about. When even in the upper room, when he says that one of them is going to betray, they have no earthly idea what it is that Jesus is talking about. But now we see this darkness beginning to rise for everybody to see. Judas all of a sudden begins to show this darkness in himself as he is kissing the Son of Man. But what we need to understand, what we need to really make note of, is how Jesus responds to this. In a display of light and in a display of love, he calls Judas by name. Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Matthew tells us that he not only called him Judas, He called him friend. He's giving him one last opportunity. He doesn't have to betray Jesus. You have one last time. I still love you, Judas. I can still redeem you. You are still my friend. One last act of love for his betrayer. Of course, Judas goes on with it. And no one really understands. Nobody really knows. The Bible doesn't say why he did it. There are a lot of speculations as to why he did it, but we really don't have any earthly idea why it was that Judas decided to betray Jesus. But here's what we do know. What we do know is that the inclination of betrayal is already in Judas before he ever betrayed him. That inclination was there already. We know that because you and I, we have that same inclination already in ourselves. It's already there in our hearts. We can't forget what Jesus said about our hearts, right? I mean, it's throughout the Bible. Genesis chapter 6, Jeremiah as well. My mind all of a sudden went blank as to where. 17? Help me out here. Heart is deceitful above 17? Okay, good. All right. Jesus says that out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery. Basically, anything that could be evil is already implanted into our hearts before we were ever born. It's just waiting for the opportunity to show itself. That inclination to betray Christ is there. And there are probably times in your lives where you have already felt like maybe you have betrayed Jesus. Maybe you had that opportunity to tell somebody about Jesus and you didn't do it. And you feel like such a betrayer. You feel like such a denier. That inclination's already there. Every evil act is already there in the heart, just looking for an opportunity. Every single one of us is born at enmity with God already. We are born with that innate ability to suppress the truth in unrighteousness. We do that from birth. And that ability does not leave us. When we come to know Jesus, we still have that ability to suppress truth. James, in his letter, he tells us that every sin that we can think of, we can try to excuse it. He says there are these passions in our hearts. And these passions don't die. In fact, they go to war with us. There is a constant battle that's going on. And he says we do not have, so we kill, we murder. We can't obtain, so we fight and we quarrel. We don't receive because we don't ask. And when we do ask, we don't receive it because we ask wrongly. We want to use it on our own passions. And then he says these words. He says, "You adulterous people." He says, "Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." And we can wonder, what in the world does that ever? What does enmity with God have to do with the passions that are going on that he's just talking about? How is that there? And he says, well, here's the thing. Go back a few verses and you will see there that he explains that these passions are bitter jealousies. You want something that you don't have. Says it right there in chapter 4 too. They're selfish ambitions. In other words, basically what he is saying is there are things in this world that you want, you don't have, but you find valuable, so you go after those things. And therefore you want to become a friend of this world. You want what this world has to offer. And when we do that, we actually end up becoming enemies of God. Those inclinations are there. They're always there. Those passions we have to always fight against. Peter says basically the same thing, that he says that there is the flesh that is within us that is battling for our very souls. All that the world has to offer. They continuously cause us to suppress that truth and unrighteousness. Yes, the truth is that I should not have these things, but I want these things, so I will excuse whatever I have to in order to get those things. I will suppress that truth. So we need to be careful that we never assume that we are past the point of betrayal. Paul says in Colossians chapter 1 that we must continue on in the faith. We must continue on in the faith. Both the Galatians and the Hebrews were seeking to go back to the old ways of doing things, the old Jewish ways, the sacrificial system or the circumcision. They were seeking to go back to the old way of doing things. And so Paul writes the letter to the Galatians, and whoever, we don't know exactly who the author of Hebrews was, but they write for basically the same reason, saying you can't go back. You would be accursed if you go back. You are trampling under your feet the very blood of Jesus if you go back. There's always the temptation to go back. The temptation to betray is always there. So we must be careful. This is where John Owen comes in. When we realize a constant enemy of the soul abides in us, what diligence and watchfulness we should have. How woeful is the sloth and negligence then of so many who live blind and asleep to this reality of sin. There is an exceeding efficacy and power in the indwelling sin of believers, for it constantly inclines itself toward evil. We need to be awake then, if our hearts would know the ways of God. Our enemy is not only upon us, as it was with Samson, but it is also in us. May we never forget that. And the thing is, we will probably, I would imagine, can't imagine how it would ever happen. We won't actually betray Jesus with a kiss. But we will certainly be able to use that friendship, that brotherhood that we have with Christ, and use it against him. Betray him just the same. Paul even says that there's going to come a day where people will not stand for sound doctrine. They will not endure sound teaching. They will wander away from truth, wander into myths. He says there's going to be a day that comes when there's going to be this great apostasy where people in the church, the people that we would think are believers that are sincere in their faith, and they will apostatize. They will leave Christ. They will betray Jesus. They will turn from the gospel message. So that day's coming. And here's the thing, brothers and sisters, we rarely do we ever see somebody turn just like that. They don't usually turn on a dime. They don't usually just all of a sudden out of nowhere, on a whim, turn away from Jesus. It is a slow turn. It is a slow drift due to negligence. We're drifting away from the light and going deeper and deeper into darkness. It's entertaining a thought here, giving in to a temptation there, ignoring our time with Christ, our time with God, one day and then another, and then another. And if we're not careful, we drift right into darkness. And yet the great thing is, just like Judas, Christ is there to call us by name and call us friend and say, hey, there's still time to come back. This takes us to that second display of the power of darkness. First one being it was displayed in a kiss, now it's displayed in a knife. And incidentally, by the way, I call this a knife because the word there isn't what we generally think of for a sword. We tend to think of like broadswords, really big swords. This is more about a big knife. It's not a steak knife, not one of these, right? It's a big knife, all right? Think of, I'm going to date myself here, Crocodile Dundee, right? Okay. Think of something like that, okay? So I call that a knife, right? That's not a knife. This is a knife kind of thing, right? Okay, so, all right. But it presents itself, in this moment, it actually even presents itself as light. The darkness is actually presenting itself as though it's the right thing to do. It's the correct way to respond. So it's even presenting, this darkness is presenting itself as light. So we go back to verse 49. And when those who were around him saw what would follow, in other words, the disciples, they saw what was going to follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. So again, it seems like finally the disciples are catching on. They're a little slow. I appreciate that because I tend to be a little slow with things as well. They're a little slow, but they finally realize what it is that what Judas is doing behind all of their backs. They realize that Judas is now betraying the Son of Man. He is betraying their Messiah, and they're having none of it. And so initially, the 11 actually go to Jesus and they, hey, should we fight back? Should we take the swords, the ones that you said that we should have, that Drew was preaching about just a couple of weeks ago? Should we take those swords and fight back? And before Jesus could even respond, Peter in his impetuous self grabs one of them, and he takes the knife and he slices off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. Here's what we need to know, because that is a dark act. Taking those swords, the desire to fight back, is that darkness that wells up in us already. It's already there. Their response to the darkness of Judas is just as dark as Judas's was. It came from that same kind of heart. And whether it was anger or whether it was fear or whether it was for revenge or some other sin that was already down there, it has been awakened. And it was ready to go. It was just waiting for the opportunity, the right moment. And it found it. And so even though only one of them took the knife in order to fight, they all had that same inclination. That was their first thought. Should we fight back? They all had the inclination of shoot first, ask questions later. They all had that inclination of, well, if it's a fight they want, it's a fight they'll get. It's dark. To fight fire with fire is darkness. But we can almost excuse it. I'm sure Peter could. Does anybody remember what Peter said before any of this took place? He says in verse 33, he says, Peter said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And so here he is, seeing that his own Lord, the Christ, the one who he is called Christ, he is being taken away. He is about to be taken away, and he's like, okay, I'm going with them. If it's death that they want, I will fight to the death. And if he's not going to die, then at least give him a reason to arrest him along with Jesus, because he's going to go with Jesus no matter what. Jesus dies, he dies. Jesus is in prison, he'll be imprisoned. And we think that's good. We think that that's the appropriate response. Yes. But do we remember what Jesus said? It's not in Luke, but do we remember what Jesus' response to Peter was? Get behind me, Satan. None of them went along with God's sovereign plan. Peter shows the darkness in its fullest part by fighting back, but none of the disciples actually went along with God's sovereign plan to have Jesus arrested and were willing to fight back. Which again, that displays the suppression of the truth. Jesus has told them the truth, and they seek to suppress it. And yet again, Jesus, in his love and in his light, he reproves the disciples and he restores the servant. And thus he takes away any reason, any proof that the disciples have done anything wrong. I mean, think about that for a moment. Can you imagine how that conversation goes if you're Malchus? I mean, it almost kind of seems like it's a Monty Python skit, right? If it happened, if they had arrested Peter for slicing Malchus's ear, it would almost be like a Monty Python skit, right? I got my ear sliced off. Everybody's looking because it's there. But it got better, right? You have no proof. Jesus, again, in his restoring of the servant, is protecting even his disciples, as dark as their motives were. No one's interested in putting putting Jesus onto trial for his disciples' mistakes. Because then they would have to call Malchus, did you get your ear sliced off? Yes. Why is it back on? Because Jesus healed me, the one that we arrested. Nobody wants to have that conversation. Beloved, it's hard not to fight back. That is in us, to fight back. It's hard to accept God's plans, that he has these plans that aren't to our liking. It's hard to go along with the suffering that God actually purposefully puts in our paths. Everything within us wants to pick up a weapon and fight back. We want to fight against the darkness with darkness. Because that's what's inside of us. We might even desire to do that in what would be considered minor ways. Again, the election's coming up. Some of you are on social media. It's hard not to find posts about each candidate, and you may want to then repost those things because they're against your candidate or against your opposition, right? They're for your candidate against the opposition. And you want to repost those things. You want to let everybody know what this person's like. But you have no earthly idea what you're reposting, if it's true or if it's false. But you know what? If it keeps that candidate out of office, who cares? But in effect, basically what you are doing, what I would be doing then if we did that, is what? Bearing false witness. And bearing false witness, as we know, is a sin. And that sin comes already from that darkness that is in our hearts. We are supposed to be a people of truth. We are supposed to be a people who love truth. So that which is a lie cannot be of the truth. And therefore, if we are going to be a people of the truth, we need to be very careful about what we post. And we do find in the scriptures themselves about how we should respond, and specifically in this political case. Paul tells Timothy, he says, first of all, then I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people. And then he explains, who are we talking about when we're talking about all the people? We're talking about the kings and all those who are in high positions. And then he gives the reason that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. And I can tell you this right now, most of the political stuff that's going on out there and all those posts that are on social media, they are neither godly, they are not dignified, they are not peaceful. But that's who we are called to be. That is the way that we are called to respond. Church family, we must fight by the power of the Spirit. We must fight off those inclinations that we already have to fight darkness out of the darkness of our hearts. To paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., it is light that drives out darkness. To replace another person's darkness with our own darkness doesn't make us any better off, because we are still in darkness. Just in a darkness that we prefer. We just like our darkness better than theirs. But we have been called to be children of light, children of love, to imitate Jesus, who is love and light. And this leads us to that last display of darkness. First, we have the display of displayed in a kiss, and then we have it displayed in a knife, and then, of course, the kerfuffle. And yes, I did need a K for my alliteration. Some would say that I am stretching the bounds for alliteration here, but actually, kerfuffle does work. Because kerfuffle actually means, I think it's appropriate, it means a commotion and agitation, which is exactly what this crowd has done. They have brought commotion, they have definitely brought some agitation onto the Mount of Olives. They come in the dead of night. Luke actually emphasizes here the point that they actually interrupted Jesus while he was still talking to his disciples. There is this commotion, there is this disturbance, there is this agitation that's going on. And they come with the intention of intimidation. And so we look at 52 and 53. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." So here are the chief priests, the elders, the guards of the temple. They're coming out in large mass in order to arrest one man. And they're carrying clubs and swords, knives. What in the world did they see or hear from Jesus in the temple that made them go, you know what? We're going to need a really big army to go and pick him up. And we're going to need some clubs and knives because this Jesus, you can't trust him. He's a revolutionary. He's a zealot, and he's going to be armed to the teeth to get us. What in the world did they hear that made them think that? That's what Jesus asks. I was in the temple every single day. What is it that brought you out here like this? Unlike Judas, though, unlike his disciples, even unlike this crowd, Jesus understood exactly what was going on. He understood exactly what the plan of God was, and he was willingly obliged to it. He willingly obliged himself to it. These were coming out for a purpose. They were coming out for God's purpose. They came out to arrest him. And he then explains to them that this is actually all part of the plan of God. This is their hour. God has planned this hour just for them in particular. This is God's providence that is going on. He has risen up these men to do such a thing as this, in this way, at this time. And then he equates this hour of the crowd to the same hour that is the hour for the power of darkness. They are the tools of the power of darkness. They are the instruments of darkness. This is Satan's hour. And he was using these men as his pawns to get done what he wanted to get done. But only by God's providential permission. And don't let it be lost on you how much leeway God actually has given to Satan here. If we go back just a few verses, the beginning of chapter 22, we see these words. Then Satan entered into Judas called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. And then in the middle of the chapter, we read these words, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he may sift you like wheat. And as Drew pointed out, it's in the plural, you disciples, all of you disciples. And now here we have Jesus saying that this is indeed the hour for the power of darkness. One disciple is possessed by Satan. All the other disciples are being sifted by Satan. And here is this group of men being led by Satan. Physically, because Judas, who is being indwelled by Satan, is leading them, but spiritually as well. In other words, this entire moment in time is all being done at the hands of Satan. Every single one is somehow influenced by Satan himself, except for Jesus. This is the darkest of dark nights. It cannot get any darker than this night. And that's not to say that there haven't been dark nights or dark days since then. There have been plenty of them. But this is the darkest of dark. No matter how many dark times, no matter how dark the darkness gets, no matter how long the darkness reigns, what we know is that it is all by providential permission by God himself. And it may come in like a kerfuffle like this did, right? Agitation, commotion, chaos. It may be more subtle, like it was with Judas. Nobody even understood. Nobody even knew that Judas had been indwelled by Satan himself. So it may come either way. But when we know that we are supposed to be, we are, not supposed to be, but we are called to be light in the darkness. John reminds us that we are supposed to follow the new commandment, the commandment to love. Why? Because he says the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. And he means that inside of you and me. The darkness in us as believers in Christ is passing away. The true light is there to shine through. And it shines through in love. That's who we're supposed to be. Our darkness, that inner darkness that so desperately wants to escape and display itself, is passing away. Replaced by the true light of Jesus Christ. And we are to then to continue to allow that light to shine. Jesus knows exactly how influential Satan was in this moment. He didn't fight back. He didn't call on his disciples to fight back. In fact, he stopped them from fighting back, all because he desired for God's will to be done. That ought to be our attitude as well, right? I mean, that's our prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. What's the next words? How many times have we prayed that prayer? We want his will to be done. At least we say that we want his will to be done. So it would really behoove us if we would take Gamaliel's advice that he gave to the Sanhedrin. You remember that advice? He says, so in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone, for if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God. So they took his advice. We need to be careful to understand God's providential permission in the dark times. Because our darkness wants to fight against darkness when God's permission has been given to the darkness. We certainly don't want to oppose God. Matthew Henry wrote, Christ was willing to wait for his triumphs till his warfare was accomplished. And we must be so too. We too must wait for the warfare to be over to get what we desire. So as we finish this passage from Luke, we've seen how dark this night truly was. There was darkness within Judas, there was darkness within the disciples, there's darkness within the crowd. Satan's fingerprints was all over this night in almost every way possible. But at the same time, we see Jesus consistently responds to each one of them, to each moment, in light and in love. John reminds us in 1 John 5:19, we know that we are from God, and that the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. And so being from God, being that we are from God, ought we not act then as if we are from God? I'm going to close with these words and a couple of my own. We're almost done. Paul says in Ephesians, he says, therefore do not become partners with them. For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. And then he says these words. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. We don't partner with darkness to combat darkness in some other area. We expose the darkness. Would you betray the Son of Man? Judas's darkness is exposed. No more of this. The darkness of the disciples is exposed. This is your hour. The power of darkness. That is the darkness of the crowds exposed. And yet Jesus also comes back with them in love. So when we feel that our world, whether we're talking about the world itself or maybe our nation or maybe that small circle of influence, familial darkness, maybe it's even darkness within ourselves. When we feel that darkness coming, here's my advice. You need to make it about me. Right? Not me. Make it about mindfulness and make it about exposure. Be mindful of who Christ is and how he has given us even direction to expose the light or expose the darkness for what it is. Remember this moment. Be mindful of this moment when Jesus in love and in light exposes what was going on, all the darkness that was going on. And then start to expose the darkness itself as children of light. We are called to be children of light. Let us then act as children of light. Let's pray.